Hello and welcome to episode 701 of the official EstablishTheRun.com podcast. My name is Adam Levitan. I'm one of the co-founders here at ETR, and we are gathered here today for a big blockbuster announcement. We are getting into the fight game. Yes, that's right. We have added an MMA product to our offerings, and it will be led by Brett Apley, who, if you followed MMA DFS at all over the last 3, 5, 10 years, I suspect you know him well from Daily Fan MMA and The Athletic. Brett, how's it going today?
It's going well, Adam. Thanks for having me on. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you today.
Of course. On today's show, we are going to talk about MMA, where the edges are, how to beat it from a DFS perspective, and lots more. If you're interested in checking out what our new MMA product will look like, head to the site, establishtheRun.com. There is a content schedule and an FAQ there. We are launching for this weekend's event, which I believe is UFC 299, main event O'Malley versus Vera. All right. Let's get into it here. I know many people listening are probably already in MMA streets. We're trying to balance that with people like me who have very little experience with the sport. But I want to start with Brett's background. I'm curious how you got into this in the first place, covering MMA. I mean, were you just out there fighting people and you're like, oh, wow, this would be really cool. I'll also bet on this and talk about this and play DFS with this. But yeah, how'd you get into the whole MMA streets?
Yeah, it definitely wasn't through fighting. I don't think most people know this, but prior to college, prior to anything MMA related, my entire life revolved around soccer. Actually, I just played soccer competitively throughout my whole childhood. It's like one of the things that my first love, one of the things I really enjoyed to do. And by the time college came around, I wasn't big enough or strong enough or fast enough to compete at that level. And so I kind of lost a competitive outlet. And I had a roommate who came from a high school wrestling background, and you go up to shake his hand and he just, the type of dude he'll just pick you up and dump you on your head. And it's so I kind of got into grappling. I was thrown into grappling, so to speak, but I started training jiu-jitsu with him because of that. And very quickly, we could do an entire separate podcast on jiu-jitsu, but very quickly I realized that in a sport like jiu-jitsu, what matters is how much you know. It's not about how big or strong or fast you are. And I can only get so much bigger and stronger. It's just, I'm 5'10", I got a skinny build, but I can learn the sport. And so I just became obsessed with jiu-jitsu. And then once you get the feedback of grappling with larger people and beating them and kind of seeing your skills develop, it's very addicting. So I got very obsessed with jiu-jitsu in college, and simultaneously, I didn't like school. The only thing school related that I've been great at is writing. I've always been a decent writer, and I always just wanted to connect my life to sports in some way. So I have a journalism background, and my degree is in journalism. My first job out of college was as a sports reporter, and so separately, I'm training jiu-jitsu. I'm watching MMA. I've always been into fantasy sports and gambling and poker, even back in the day, and sort of having that be coupled with my background in journalism gave me a pretty good basis to start writing.
Super cool. So you were covering it. You launched your own site, and now welcome to all those people from Daily Fan MMA who are coming over as well. So you've gone full-blown jiu-jitsu bro, businessman. I love it.
Yep.
I think this started to get popular a relatively long time ago. I mean, I remember, 10, 15, 20 years ago, it started to get popular. It seems like it's really exploded over the last 5 years. And there's a ton of DFS action too. And one of the reasons that we wanted to launch this was because the once a week format of MMA, I think, is more conducive to covering it and covering it well. And also for people playing it with not nearly as much time needed to study. So those are my theses on why it's gotten so popular. I'm curious why you think MMA has gotten so popular, both in real life and in DFS.
Well, I mean, it wasn't that long ago where I think MMA as a sport was just kind of frowned upon. The optics of it are not great. Just on face value, it's dudes punching each other in the face. You don't know the strategy. There's blood. It looks dangerous. Like in New York, as of 2015, MMA was illegal. I mean, we both know New York likes to check the legality of things, and MMA was illegal. But since that time, the sport has grown tremendously. ESPN has deals with organizations even outside of the UFC, so viewership has skyrocketed. And for me, where things really changed was during COVID, where the world was shut down. It's a very unfortunate time, but one of the fortunate things that came from COVID was that there was a lot of attention on the UFC, and that was the only sport active. And that allowed a lot of people to cross the hurdle of, okay, I will now watch a fight for the first time. I don't know what I'm getting into. I don't know what's happening, but let me check it out because it's the only sport that's going on. And you'll quickly realize that once you have context of the background of the fighters, the styles, what you can expect from a fight, just fights are so much more entertaining to watch. And you can push to the side the more negative optics of it. And that's when the prize pool started growing dramatically too, because in 2015, when DraftKings launched this sport, no one cared about it. Prize pools sucked.
Mhm.
It just, there was no attention on it. But since COVID, there's been 100K to first pretty much every week. And we have 200K to first in this upcoming pay-per-view, which is a really amazing card. So once people were able to watch it for the first time, they realized how entertaining it is. And then just the way the sport is set up itself, like the sweat is incredible because you can watch literally every second of action from the start of the card to the end of the card. Where NFL, I got 4 games on my television, I got 2 games on my computer. I'm still tilted because I need a third screen to cover all the morning games. Where MMA is one fight at a time, it builds, and you got the entirety of like a primetime slate taking place over a 5 to 15 minute sample in the form of people fighting each other. So it's very intense. There's crazy swings, and the sweat equity is pretty phenomenal.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I remember like I know this is ridiculous, but when I was in high school, people would like fight each other and they would plan to fight each other. It'd be like I'm gonna fight so and so at X time at the tennis courts, and
We're
everybody it was like a huge event, and nobody cared. It wasn't like, oh, we're playing basketball. Nobody cared to come watch basketball. Everybody goes to watch fights. So I mean, this has been going on for a very very long time
Yeah,
for
were
sure.
you the guy fighting, or were you the guy taking wagers on the side with
What do
the
you think?
crowd?
What do you
The latter.
Okay. Let's get into it with the actual DFS and MMA. So I always try to think about when I'm trying to win or think about a new sport, where are people making mistakes? Because really, that's where our biggest edge is. If we think someone else is doing something wrong, if we think other people are playing poorly, our edge is in not doing that. So I'm curious where you think that big edge is in MMA, DFS, and where people are making mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a loaded question because I think your edge can come from a lot of different places depending on your skill set and your background. If you have a background in math, you can have an edge. People know simulations far better than I do. Um, in MMA, what I really like about the sport and what makes it different from other sports is that there's like a pretty extreme lack of data. And just as an example, like you have fighters who are making their UFC debuts 15-2 professionally. And you're like, okay, great. Let me go watch tape on this guy who's got 17 pro wins. And you find they only got one fight available on YouTube. It's on the Peruvian regional scene and it lasted 45 seconds. And there's no track statistics. So it makes the betting markets extremely inefficient. Lines move all the time because such drastic assumptions are made. And I'll even give you another example. Like we have a Taekwondo Olympian making his UFC debut this Saturday. And this is just from memory, but I think he's 4-0 professionally in MMA. Adam, 3 of his 4 fights didn't last longer than 12 seconds. So he's a massive favorite on Saturday. All of his wins are literally just kicking a guy in the head in 10 seconds or less and winning the fight. And people make drastic assumptions based on such small sample sizes. And even with fighters who have competed in the UFC for a long period of time, you got guys with 5, 10 fights on their record, they're still very small samples, and people
Mhm.
largely ignore data in MMA. So one of the cool parts about it compared to a sport like NFL, you watch all 22 footage or whatever, like tape bros can have success because you can pull a lot of context out of um, footage while the markets are generally making pretty large assumptions based on such small pieces of data. So from my perspective, where my edge comes in is being able to understand matchups and contextually a little bit better than the average person, because there's you can dig into it more than the markets. But there's also edges to be had in like general lineup construction, which we can talk about, and leverage, things that would carry over from other DFS sports.
Yeah, well, let's talk about it. What do you think about lineup construction? I think most people are going to come in and run projections through an optimizer. I'm not sure that's optimal in this sport like it is in other sports. What do you think about lineup construction and use of projection slash optimizers?
Yeah, so I think the important thing to note with standard base projections is that this is a binary sport, in which case there's going to be a winner, there's going to be a loser. And as an example, a classic heavyweight fight, like the main event last week, a standard heavyweight fight that's projected to end inside the distance, end very quickly. Um, those fighters are never going to project well at a base level, because there's not a long enough period for them to accrue points, and the entirety of their score will be based on whether or not they win quickly, they win in round one or round two. And fighters like that won't project very well, and they'll project pretty evenly with each other. So you'll have a minus 110, minus 110, both projecting at 60. Comparatively to the rest of the slate, they're not going to project very well at their salaries. But because this is a binary sport, like the true outcomes of those matchups are that one of those fighters wins by knockout in round one and scores 110, and the other scores 0. And because of that, they're still great tournament plays. So standard base projections are better geared toward cash games, and I think you need to take an entirely different approach. You can still look at them for tournaments, but you need to take an entirely different approach for tournaments where you're shooting for the stars. You kind of ignoring risk. You're shooting for upside. You need 6 wins in your lineup. So at base level, that's what I would say about projections.
So in our projections, we will have, and by the way, these will be up Friday. We will have a base projection like Brett is referring to. And then we also have a projection column if win. In other words, if the fighter wins, this is how many points that we project him for, which I think is a cool feature because it allows you to see, hey, I want to pull in this guy. He's going to pull an upset. Well, if I think he's going to pull an upset, how many points would he score in that case? And that can lead me to some interesting plays, which I hope I'm understanding that right or
Yeah,
explaining
you
that right.
you are, and I guess just the only caveats to it are that MMA, again, it's a very high variance sport too, in that literally any fighter on the slate can win. Doesn't matter how big of an underdog you are, and any fighter can win by knockout. So in theory, although we'll project floor and we'll casually project floor and ceiling are almost not real, in the sense that any fighter can score 0 points. They can get knocked out quickly. And conversely, any fighter can win by knockout in the first round and score 120. So there's that wide range. And that's also why understanding the matchups contextually is very important, because it will put more value onto the projections that we show. But of course, we take projections very seriously, both base projections, if win projections, and ownership as well, which is important.
For sure. Um, Kind of reminds me a little bit of tennis in that someone's going to win and someone's going to lose. And whoever wins is going to obviously score far more. I think a big difference is that in tennis, upsets are really hard. I mean, the best players in the world are playing someone who's number 50 in the world. That guy who's number 50 is almost never going to win, whereas it is way more volatility here. The other kind of parallel that I see is with betting markets and line movement. So the way the tennis market works is DraftKings will price the tennis players based on the opening lines roughly. But then after those lines come out, the DraftKings salaries don't move, but the lines move a ton. And so everybody just piles into these guys who have moved in their favor a ton. They're effectively priced on DraftKings in a stale way relative to the betting market. Do you see this in UFC? How efficient do you think the betting markets are in UFC? You just mentioned you didn't think it was that efficient. And is this where ownership flows to? Do you think that's right, et cetera, and all this line movement stuff versus DK salaries?
Yeah, and the difference in I'm not a huge follower of tennis, but the difference I would say is in the variance, in tennis being a lower variance sport and MMA being a higher variance sport. And so you're still going to get the standard values. And like, for example, we had a late replacement last week. Someone pulled out of the fight. They brought in a new guy on short notice. The salaries or the salary for the favorite was already reflected. They just tossed the new guy in at the opposing salary, which made him like a clear value. And people will flock to those values. They're obvious. It's a good way to create a high floor ceiling, construction. You want to be targeting values in the long run, but because it's a higher variance sport, values are not necessarily safe, and they can provide very real leverage opportunities. Leverage is something that we'll talk about very in depth within the article and the podcast. It's a very important part of MMA lineup building. In that, just as in the example last week, the underdog, who was an essential pick'em, projected at like 45% owned, which is among the highest on the slate. Where if that fighter loses, not only is 45% of the field dead, but his opponent has now won the fight, in which case they're going to contend for the optimal lineup at a much lower percentage. And so that's something we talked about in depth, being the opponent, Oliveira, being a primary leverage target on this slate. And it funny enough, it was a crazy fight, and it ended Oliveira, the non-value, ended up winning by like a flying knee knockout in the third round. So leverage opportunities are integral to MMA, and it's something that we very much focus on a matchup to matchup level.
Yeah, that strikes me as the most important possible thing, and we'll obviously be doing a ton to get the best ownership projections that we possibly can up. It strikes me that there's some art to this and understanding how fighters match up with each other. And, we talk about matchups, some in NFL and NBA, and I think it's important. But in sports like this, it has to be the most important thing. Certain kinds of fighters faring better against each other, certain fighters faring against each other. How do you go about knowing who matches up well with who?
Well, and there's two different ways to answer this, one relating to DraftKings and one not relating to DraftKings. And in terms of pure MMA analysis, which I wrote an article, I think it's up live on ETR right now, just talking about how I analyze mixed martial arts. And again, it's one of the edges that I think I have in the process, where I analyze the sport that doesn't have a lot of data. There's a lot of things out there that there's a lot of ways in which people analyze martial arts that are just not predictive. There's a lot of noise. I mean, you'll get people constantly talking about, well, we'll wait until weigh-ins to see, for me to determine who's going to pick to win. You got to see the guy with his shirt off on the scale in order for you to determine who's going to win the fight. Those kind of things I don't put as much stock into. Interviews I don't put as much stock into. You're getting every single fighter saying they're in the best shape of their life. It relates to every other sport as well. But I find my edges in targeting fighters who can control where the fight takes place, who can produce consistent, effective offense, who don't need to be reliant on some crazy, flashy knockouts, and who have cardio and durability to sustain their style. That's the simple version of it, and it's not an extremely complex process. It's not a process that I've tried to gatekeep at all. I've preached this for many years. I want fighters who can produce consistent offense, which a lot of the time means I'm against the market, because the fighters who can win by knockout in 12 seconds are the ones who are going to be very, very popular. But the problem is, if you win in 12 seconds and that's the only piece of footage on your record, you don't know what their skill is like over the course of 5 minutes, let alone 15 minutes. You don't know what their durability is like. You don't know what their cardio is like. You don't know what their wrestling and grappling is like. And these are very, very important aspects of MMA. And typically, Adam, when you do not know how good the fighter is in those areas, the answer is not usually good. So I focus on, from a pure MMA analysis standpoint, fighters who can control where the fight takes place. If you're a striker, can you keep the fight on the feet? If you're a wrestler, can you land takedowns in a given matchup? And then fighters who can produce consistent offense to at least give them a chance to win rounds on the scorecards.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So on the DFS specifics, is DraftKings the only place for real action? Is there any other sites that we can grind, even if they're smaller sites?
I mean, yeah, there's other sites. You can play FanDuel. FanDuel just doesn't put a lot of effort into their product. And, there's the prop markets out there. DraftKings is far and away the primary place for DFS, and that's what we focus on.
Okay, the scoring system on DraftKings, I think people should probably familiarize themselves with if they haven't. But is there anything in the scoring system that you think goes overlooked? I know in some like in soccer DFS a long time ago, people just were not weighting crosses enough into their who they were picking, and that was big edge. There's stuff like takedowns are 5 points, reversal slash sweep is 5 points. Obviously, there's all the win bonus stuff. Is there anything in the scoring system you think people should be aware of?
Well, I mean, yes, but I guess the simple answer is just to let people know how this works. You're getting points for when your fighter wins, and then you're getting points for what they do within the fight. And the sooner they win, the better. So if they win in round one, you're getting a floor of 90 points. That's almost always going to contend for the optimal lineup. And the further down the board you get, second round, third round, let alone by decision, you're getting fewer points. Decision win is 30 points compared to 90 in the first round. So you just have a much lower floor, and it just means you're going to need that many more in-fight actions to boost the score up. From a in-fight action perspective, striking and grappling are scored drastically differently. Strikers, pretty much the only way for them to score points is by landing significant strikes, which, for context, if you have a fighter two boxers who are going at it for 15 minutes, the winner lands 100 significant strikes, that's 40 points plus a 30-point decision. That's 70 points. That's very rarely going to ever contend for the optimal lineup. If you're playing a striker, if you're rostering a striker, your goal, it has to be for them to win by early knockout. That's really the main way they're going to ever contend for the optimal lineup. And it makes those plays very boom or bust, where conversely, grapplers can still land strikes on the feet. They can land takedowns. They can accrue strikes on the ground. They can accrue control time, which DraftKings has to make it as complex as possible. It's like 0.3 points per second of control, which I think is like 1.8 points per minute. But you get ground control, and then, ground fighters can still win inside the distance as well. So grapplers score much better than strikers, and even if grapplers win by decision, sometimes you're getting a fighter who has the 30 points in a decision win plus 8 takedowns, which is 40 points. You have another 12 minutes of ground control and 100 non-significant strikes. Like, you can quickly rack up points, and the floor and ceiling with grapplers is far higher than that of a striker.
Yeah. And to be clear, we don't want you to double count this. This will all be in Brett's content and in the projections, all this stuff. So we don't want you to double count this stuff. Brett's going to handle all that for you. Okay. Do we ever want to roster fighters against each other? Now, obviously, one is going to score relatively low and one is going to score high. But if a match goes the distance and they both get a bunch of strikes or takedowns or whatever, and maybe they can both score reasonably enough, do we ever want to have fighters playing against each other?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a question, probably the most asked question I've gotten over my career. It's very enticing because you're guaranteeing yourself a win. You're guaranteeing yourself a high floor of points. The problem is, in tournaments, you're almost always going to need 6 wins to take it down. And by stacking a fight, which is what we call it, you're already chopping out one of your legs. And the reason why people will still do it is because occasionally losers do end up on the optimal lineup, and occasionally one of those losers is paired with a winner. So fight stacks can be optimal. And, if there's 45 slates in a year, maybe maybe 1 or 2 times a fight stack is optimal, but it's not going to be much more than that. People get carried away because it happens occasionally, and because you can give yourself a high floor by doing so. But I strongly recommend in tournaments shooting for 6 wins. That's what's generally going to be needed to take down a tournament. Where conversely, in cash games, your goal isn't to win first place out of 35,000 lineups. You're just trying to beat 50% of the field. You're just trying to beat your head-to-head opponent. And you do have to roster a couple underdogs here. So the strategy, becomes, well, if you already have to roster an underdog, you might as well roster one who has a high floor. And most often the high floor, well projected underdogs are going to be those in the main event, which is not something we've discussed yet, but Main events are 5 rounds. Championship fights are 5 rounds. And all other fights generally are 3 rounds. So the main event favorite and underdog are always going to project fairly well compared to those in the surrounding price ranges. And therefore, the main event will always be in stat consideration. And it's still slate dependent, but very often in cash, I will punt with one of my underdogs to use the remaining salary to get myself more comfortable favorites and or stack that main event, guaranteeing myself a solid floor and just kind of using one of those underdog slots on a fighter who has 25-minute potential.
Interesting. Okay. What about female versus male fights? I mean, I've seen there's a bunch of female fights. I don't know what the scoring distribution looks like between them or anything. How do you think about female versus male?
The main difference is that male fights will be projected to end quicker than female fights. Female fights are generally expected to go the distance, and that's not to say that all do, because they don't. But there's less scoring in female MMA, women's MMA. Just there's less dominant performances. Fights end by decision, and they're also lower owned. The women's fighters are not as highly owned as male fighters, and you know, there are
And cheaper? Cheaper too?
no, because pricing
Okay.
is just dependent on the betting odds and
Right.
and the pricing. So if you're 8.2K, your opponent will always be 8K, 8.3, 7.9, 8.4, 7.8. So they're not priced any differently. It's just um, the expectation of a floor and ceiling. Maybe they have better floors because they're expected to last the distance,
Sure.
but ceiling wise, they won't project as well. A lot of times people will target the underdog in women's MMA because it feels like the underdog wins more often than not there, but I don't have like enough data to back that up.
So it strikes me that it's kind of important to try to project how long a fight will go. And maybe not as important as who's going to win, but still important. How much emphasis do you place on projecting how long a fight's going to go? And how do you even go about projecting how long a fight's going to go?
I would say more than how long a fight is projected to last. It's the pace of the fight itself. The number of exchanges is extremely important to me, and it's probably another one of the edges that you might gain on the field because yeah, you can look at a fight that's projected to end in 7 minutes, but like 7 minutes of action could look completely different depending on who's fighting in it. And if it's two heavyweights, they might just be standing staring at each other for 7 minutes with an occasional one shot. Where if you got a fight that's projected to last 7 minutes where guys are just willing to go to war and throw down, you're going to get so many more exchanges in that matchup that it's just going to increase your floor and ceiling combination. And I will do everything in my power to target the fights that are projected to take place with the highest pace. As far as purely projecting how long a fight takes place, you can just look at over unders, 1.5 rounds, 2.5 rounds, wherever it's placed on the market. That'll give you a general idea of what to expect. But I usually think fights tend to be projected to last a shorter amount of time than I would project them. So I'm always more inclined to think fights are going to last a little bit longer than other people do. Whereas, it's always nice to believe, someone's going to just win by knockout quickly, but there's a lot of elements in knocking your opponent out that are difficult. And sometimes, a lot of times this doesn't
Sure.
happen.
I mean, if I saw a dude win by kick to the face in 3 of his 4 fights, I'd be like, all right, I'm not gonna let him kick me in the face. If he wants to punch, I don't know anything, but
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
What would you do? I'm curious. I'm curious about this game plan. Just kidding.
I'd hide in the corner. Okay.
Yeah.
I always hear people bitching about the judges, and is this just like people bitch about everything now? I can't take it, but it
Mhm.
seems like some actual smart people bitch about judges in this stuff too. Is it a real issue, the judges and the scoring and all this?
Yeah, I mean, if you like tilting on sports, you will love MMA. There's a lot of things to bitch about, and judging is one of them. Judging is one of them. Scoring is one of them. The thing is, it's just another form of variance, and variance takes place in so many different ways. You got Mike Evans dropping a 50-yard touchdown. Well, that's variance. It could have gone the other way. In MMA, it's like, I analyze the fight. I am pretty sure fighter X is going to win. I go and watch fighter X clearly win a decision, and the judges give it to the other guy, and I'm tilting my face off. But it's not just because judges suck. It's because judges are pushed into one corner of the octagon, like ringside. They can't see everything that's going on. They don't have replays. They don't have access to statistics. And it's like they're just judging basically based on what they happen to see from their angles. And I've people do not agree with me about this, but I've always been a proponent that we should remove judges and just replace them with robots and have robots score the fights like they actually do in well, they have real judges too, but in PFL, which is a different organization, they have a smart cage which tracks data within the fight, and then they use an algorithm to score it, which I just think is better in the long run. But that's a different topic for another day. Essentially, there's variance in judging. There's variance in the way that DraftKings scoring provider scores strikes and takedowns. It's not all extremely consistent, and it can be frustrating at times. But I could tell you every single time in my MMA career out of 10 years I've been screwed. I don't remember any of the times where the luck went in my favor. So it's just kind of standard with other sports. I'm more than happy to chat with people and tilt along with everyone, but in reality, the important thing to know is despite there being several forms of variance, over the long run, it does all even out. You'll get screwed sometimes, and scores will go your way other times. But again, it adds to the sweat equity. You watch your fighter win a decision. Now you
Yeah.
gotta hope the judges get it right too.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like insane that they can't watch replays. I mean, that's ridiculous. Or they can't have access to the stats and everything. That seems absolutely
Mm-hmm.
crazy to me. Maybe there'll be some reform there. The other thing I always hear people bitching about is this whole late swap conversation. My God. I mean, I thought this was limited to basketball, but I've seen a bunch of MMA people with the late swap debate also. Where are we at now on late swap? Do you think there is edges here to be found at all? And what do you think about the whole controversy?
No, so DraftKings did add late swap at the end of last year because the thing is sometimes fighters pull out during a card. Like it's very frustrating. It's another form of in-fight variance. They don't report on health issues. So like literally a couple weeks ago, we're 8 fights through the card, and they're like, okay, by the way, Raul Rosas has been sick all day and he's not fighting. And it's like people are pissed. It sucks. It's one of the reasons why people are in the streets demanding late swap. But the problem is DraftKings did add late swap and they couldn't manage it. Late swap doesn't help the casual player, although pretty much every casual player I've ever talked to wants late swap. And conversely, pros, although it probably does help them, they don't want to spend their entire nights, resimulating events and uploading CSVs and stuff like that. So I don't think late swap will help the product. I do wish there was some way for if a fighter gets scratched mid card for us to change our lineups, but that's more of a reporting issue than a DraftKings issue. And ultimately, DraftKings did try late swap. They decided to lock every fight when the UFC scheduled it 30 minutes apart. And the problem is fights don't all last
Right.
the entire amount of time. So a fight would last 2 minutes, and the next fight would start 10 minutes after that, and DraftKings would just not correctly lock or unlock fights. So every slate they had with late swap was messed up, which is why they reverted it. I think we're better off without late swap personally.
Okay. Yeah. I always lean towards that. Also, it's extremely frustrating, obviously, but like Brett said, it should even out in the end. Your guys should get scratched just as much as our opponents' guys get scratched over the infinite time horizon, hopefully. All right. This was very enlightening for me. I'm excited to play my first ever MMA slate. Why don't you tell Brett, the people, where they can find you on Twitter, and then also briefly what you think or what people should expect out of the product in terms of content?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, Brett Apley, double T, double P, as the kids say. As far as the content, we have a pretty in-depth written breakdown. That's kind of one of my specialties. I'm mostly through it this week for the card on Saturday. It's the card this week is phenomenal. Not every card is as good as UFC 299 will be, but this is a great card. A lot of fights, a lot of entertaining fights. We're going to cover everything in depth as we possibly can: fighter background, styles, path to victories, probabilities, and then separately we're covering DraftKings analysis there too. What does it need what will it take for our fighter to be optimal, leverage positions, ownership like that. We do the same thing on our premium show, which will be Thursday with my co-host, Mr. Gordo Gambles. And then we have, projections and ownership, which we take very seriously as well, rankings, and a great community. I know we're adding a private Discord here. I've previously had public Discords in the past. The MMA is has a very hardcore fan base,
Yeah.
and so people very much appreciate attention given to MMA. So I thank you for having me on, and for allowing me to continue to do MMA coverage here. And yeah, I would just encourage anyone who hasn't watched the sport but might be a little bit interested, we will be happy to walk you through everything, get you initiated, and would love to have you in the community. And again, it's even outside of my content, it's an awesome sport. The sweat equity is incredible, and I do think you will enjoy it once you start to watch it.
My younger son is currently holding a purple belt in Taekwondo. He is one belt away from sparring, aka getting his ass kicked. He's 6 years old. So I am
Wow.
excited to sit down with him and watch some actual professional fighters go at it. Be sure you're following Brett on Twitter. If you have signed up for the product, be sure that you have logged into Discord. And this is, our Discord works in that each channel is paywalled to the topic that you are subscribed to. So if you subscribe to MMA, you'll be in the MMA channel with other people who are very into MMA. Also, that's worked really well for us in the Discord. I think people really enjoy it. So be sure you take the time to get into the Discord. For more information, head to establishthedrun.com. Look in the tab under MMA. You'll get everything you need to know there. For Brett, for producer Ryan, for producer Luke, for everyone behind the scenes who has helped put this MMA launch together, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.